Content warning. This video contains discussion of transmisogynistic violence, sexual assault, murder, drug use, and pedophilia. Part 0. They reached the canal along the track leading up from the river, their slingshots drawn for battle and their eyes squinting, almost stitched together, in the midday glare. There were 5 of them, their ringleader the only one in swimming trunks. Red shorts that blazed behind the parched crops of the cane fields still low in early May. The rest of the troop trailed behind him in their underwear, all 4 caked in mud up to their shins, all 4 taking turns to carry the pail of small rocks they'd taken from the river that morning, all 4 scowling and fierce and so ready to give themselves up for the cause that not even the youngest, bringing up the rear, would have dared admit he was scared. The elastic of his slingshot pulled taut in his hands, the rock snug in the leather pad, primed to strike anything that got in his way at the very first sign of an ambush, be that the caw of the bienteveo, perched unseen like a guard in the trees behind them, the rustle of leaves being thrashed aside, or the whoosh of a rock cleaving the air just beyond their noses. The breeze warm and the almost white sky thick with ethereal birds of prey and a terrible smell that hit him harder than a fistful of sand in the face, a stench that made them want to hawk it up before it reached their guts, that made them want to stop and turn around. But the ringleader pointed to the edge of the cattle track, and all 5 of them, crawling along the dry grass, all 5 of them packed together in a single body, all 5 of them surrounded by blowflies, finally recognized what was peeping out from the yellow foam on the water surface. The rotten face of a corpse, floating among the rushes and the plastic bags, swept in from the road on the breeze, the dark mask seething under a myriad of black stakes, smiling. That was the first chapter of Fernanda Melchor's Hurricane Season, an unrelenting, violence-filled fever dream of a novel. It starts with the discovery of a corpse, a woman simply named the Witch. If she has another name, no one else knows it. In its 8 chapters, Melchor takes the reader through 8 different accounts of the witch's murder, illustrating her place in the fictional Mexican village of La Matosa in the state of Veracruz, and the various ways she was perceived by the townspeople. The novel's chapters are full of long, winding sentences that offer no convenient place to pause as you're reading, a choice that is actively hostile to the reader and invokes a sense of claustrophobia, as these characters' environments offer no reprieve from the constant physical, sexual, and emotional violence. Melchor's novel mirrors that experience for her reader. Throughout this video, I'll discuss the various factors that led to the witch's death and analyze the ways that Melchor uses this novel to humanize the victims of transphobia and femicide. The first chapter shows the discovery of the witch's body, as we just heard, and the second chapter gives us a lot more background on the witch. Then the next 4 chapters, which are all considerably longer, one of them's like 60 pages, for each of the next 4 chapters, each one is narrated from the third-person perspective of a specific character in La Matosa. First, we meet Yesenia, who is determined to prove to her grandmother that her cousin Luismi is no good and is up to dirty deeds with the witch. Next, we hear Luismi's stepfather Munra's side of the story. He drove Luismi and his friend Brando to the witch's house, and they came out carrying her unconscious body, but Munra claims that he had nothing to do with the murder. Luismi's 13-year-old pregnant fiancée, Norma, narrates the next chapter, and we learned that the witch provided Norma with an abortion, which landed her in the hospital after Norma started to lose a lot of blood. Finally, we hear Brando's side of the story, full of violent, internalized homophobia and sexual aggression that culminates in the witch's death. Luismi held the knife, but Brando guided his hand. In the 7th chapter, we return to a collective perspective, and Melchor illustrates the escalating violence in the region and the rising tension like atmospheric pressure before a hurricane, hence the title Hurricane Season. Finally, in the last chapter, we meet an old man who is digging a mass grave, and as he talks to the bodies, the witch's body is implied to be among them. He comforts them with assurances that death is the only way out of this never-ending violence. Part 1, The Witch. So, this overview of the plot tells us a lot about the world that the witch and these other characters live in, and the fact that they are just surrounded by violence. But who actually was the witch? The closest thing we ever get to actually hearing her voice is in that 2nd chapter, when Melchor walks the reader through what the people of La Matosa know about her. which isn't a lot. Her mother, known as the Old Witch, was a mysterious widow who lived in a boarded-up house and helped the women of the community with anything from a remedy for indigestion to abortion care to curses on those who had wronged them. One day, a daughter appeared, first called the girl, then the young witch, then just the witch. No one knew where she came from, but some thought she must be the spawn of the devil, since the Old Witch was cagey about who the father was. Her mother physically and verbally abused her, calling her slurs, and the witch grew up isolated and pitied by the townspeople. Melchor says on page 16, "The whole town assumed and hoped and even prayed that she'd meet an early grave, be put out of her misery, because sooner or later the devil was coming to claim her." As the Old Witch got older and her mind started to go, the witch took over expenses, making sure that the townswomen paid the Old Witch for her services, and ensuring that she and her mother would be able to keep their home. The only people that the witch wouldn't charge were the most vulnerable women and girls in need of her help. Those girls from the highway, not the meddlesome old bags in town, were the only ones the witch chose to help for free. Although maybe, in the end, she helped those girls from the highway because they weren't ashamed to be seen going to her house. When the witch helps Norma by providing her with an abortion, she is clearly concerned for the girl's well-being, yelling from her porch instructions and pleading with her to take the concoction in the safety of the witch's mansion. There's also continuous reference to a locked room in her house that the townspeople think must contain treasure, because in their opinion, there's no other reason why she would keep it locked up. She refused to allow any of her visitors inside and was just generally very cagey about what was inside of this room. So we know from all of this information that the witch was practical, but not heartless. She was isolated, and she was abused from a young age. We also know that the witch was a woman with desires, and because she was so isolated, she would pay for the young men in town in order to meet her sexual needs. These men would, quote, get it over with as fast as they could, and the witch would slip money into their pocket as payment. Even during sex, we see that she remains isolated. On page 21, Melchor writes, "I didn't even have to look her in the face. One of those thugs would brag to whoever would listen. He hadn't even had to do anything apart from put up with her wondering hands and let himself be licked by a mouth that was also a shadow, poking in and out from behind the scratchy, grubby fabric that veiled her face. She only ever lifted it when strictly necessary, and even then only a fraction, never fully revealing herself, a detail for which they were grateful, just as they were grateful for the absolute silence of the whole act. No moaning or sighing, no distractions or words of any sort." With the availability of her body, though, came violence, as in the novel, the two are always intertwined. The girls from the highway could see the impact of this violence on the witch's body and on her home, as we see on page 23. The witch appeared, dressed in her black tunic and that crooked veil, which, even in the full light of day, in that bomb site of a kitchen with the kettle tipped on its side and the grimy, blood-spattered floor, couldn't hide the swollen bruising on her eyelids, the scabs where her lip and bushy eyebrows had split. These girls, the most vulnerable of the witch's clientele, were the only ones she would share her pain with because, as Melchor writes on page 24, they understood and knew firsthand the full, brutal force of male vice. As word spread that the witch paid for it, sex turned into parties full of drugs and singing, the one place, it seemed, that the witch could truly express herself. In Brando's chapter later in the novel, Melchor describes these parties in more detail. The witch brought her guests to the basement of her house, and only then would she remove her veil, dress up in costumes and wigs that broke out of her usual all-black morning attire, and get her guests high on weed, pills, and mushrooms. Finally, when everyone was, as Melchor writes, well and truly fucked, the witch would get on stage and begin to sing, and, according to Brando, sometimes it looked like she was crying. Even in her attempts to find community, connection, and love, the witch remained separate from her guests, and it seemed that she could only allow herself to be vulnerable when her guests were in an altered mental state, unable to judge her. We even see that she pressured her guests to take the pills, as Brando recounts a time when, quote, the witch had hassled him for so long that he'd had to pretend to take one. Another important thing to know about the witch is the fact that she's trans. Melchor makes the purposeful move of not giving any hints or information that would lead the reader to assume that she's trans from the very beginning. There's nothing to really heavily imply it or tell the reader that she is until about 82 pages in. In Munra's chapter, we get the first explicit indication of her transness when he recounts his shock and disgust upon realizing that, quote, the witch they all went on about was, in fact, a man, a fellow of about 40, 45 back then, dressed in black clothing, in ladies' clothing, with long black painted nails. Gruesome. Once you realize that she's trans, it adds a deeper understanding of why she faced such violence in her life and in her death. Not only did she have to live as a woman in a deeply patriarchal society, but she existed as one of the most vulnerable demographics in the LGBTQ+ community, a trans woman. We'll get into how that intersection of oppressions led to her death later, but for now, just to understand that her murder was explicitly motivated by a violent fear and disgust of trans women. Part 2. Public women. Miranda Wright's article, Necropolitics, Narcopolitics, and Femicide, Gendered Violence on the U.S.-Mexico Border, examines the Mexican government's response to an alarming increase in violence towards women. To do this, Wright examines the concept of necropolitics, which highlights the ways that the threat of death is used by governments as a tool for state security and control. The term was coined by post-colonial scholar Achille Mbembe, who defined it as politics as a work of death, as quoted in Wright's article on page 708. Mbembe introduced the concept as an elaboration and correction of Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics, which argues that modern governmental control functions through the policing of living bodies, rather than through the threat of death as a consequence of disobedience. Mbembe disagrees with Foucault's claim that governments no longer use death as a tool of the state, and his theory of necropolitics addresses this issue. If this concept is going over your head, don't worry, it's a complex one that I by no means completely understand, so if my explanation is a bit unclear, Miranda Wright might be able to explain it a bit more clearly. She writes on page 709, Mbembe, however, employs Foucault's analysis to turn attention to how the meaning of death in necropolitics, like the meaning of life in biopolitics, emerges through interpretations of embodiment, of corpses, of who kills, and of who is targeted for death. Biopolitics is intimately wound into necropolitics, since governments protect the lives of some by justifying the deaths of others. Thus, he argues, addressing the relationship between politics and death is essential for understanding how states emerge through the reproduction of death, including its meaning and representation as the counterpart to life. Put simply, the bodies left behind in the violence sweeping through northern Mexico reveal crucial information about whose lives are valued and whose are not. In 1993, dozens of women's bodies started to be found dumped like garbage in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. The government, rather than working to find the perpetrators of this violence, chose instead to blame the victims. This isn't an unfamiliar response for anyone who's heard the question, well, what was she wearing? In response to a woman's sexual assault, but it's a deeply misogynistic and violent response nonetheless. The government insisted the victims were leading double lives as sex workers or drug addicts. The characterization of obreras, or female workers, as typifying a kind of public woman relies on a negative interpretation of prostitution as emblematic of women who are contaminated by their activities in the public sphere and who, in turn, contaminate their families, communities, and nations. The political stakes of such a characterization are even more apparent when contrasted to the term public man, which in Mexico is another way of saying citizen. Taken to its logical extreme, the government's public woman discourse explains that, while unfortunate, the deaths of public women represent a kind of public cleansing, as the removal of troublesome women restores the moral and political balance of society. In other words, the government's response was essentially an insistence that a woman existing outside of the domestic private sphere is a cause for shame, enough so that their murders were justified. Rather than working to stop the violence, the Mexican government warned families to supervise their women, placing the burden of responsibility firmly on the victim's shoulders. The necropolitics of the government's response indicates a patriarchal acceptance of violence against women. The necropolitics of the government's response indicates a patriarchal acceptance of violence against women and girls, as their deaths were seen as inconsequential and even positive. As Wright says, their deaths symbolized a cleansing of northern Mexican society. This trend of murders, along with the lack of government response, has been called femicide by activist groups. In response to governmental apathy towards femicide, activists worked to establish an empathetic and humanity-focused perspective of the victims in the public consciousness. They didn't outright reject the patriarchal view of women belonging to the private sphere, but rather they emphasized that the public women were only public because they were working to provide for their families. In Wright's words, the victims were in public space for private reasons. They were augmenting their family income by working outside of the home. The activists countered the discourse by declaring that the victims represented the very core of Mexican society. As the activists portrayed the victims, they were not sex workers, which would publicly be considered to be a cause for shame. And that's how the government was justifying these murders, was saying that they were sex workers on the basis of if they were killed and they were sex workers, then that's fine and okay, which obviously it's not. But rather than them being sex workers, they were family-focused daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers. To bring our discussion back to hurricane season, the discovery of the witch's body speaks to the gendered and transphobic necropolitics of La Matosa. She, too, is dumped like garbage in the canal, her body mutilated. When you consider the witch's engagement with sex work and with drugs, along with the health care that she provided to the sex workers at the local brothel, she clearly fits the definition of a woman who would be seen as too public. Her death, rather than sparking outrage and a full investigation, only sparked sorrow for the women that knew her, and a self-serving onslaught of home invaders searching for her supposed fortune hidden away in that dilapidated house. But Wright's article leaves out a crucial element that we can't gloss over when discussing the necropolitics of the witch's murder. She only discusses femicide through the lens of a binary, heteronormative, and cisnormative society, with no acknowledgement of the intersectionality of oppressions faced by queer and trans Mexican women. In order to fill that gap, we need to acknowledge that the lives of trans women are uniquely dismissed. We have to talk about transmisogyny. Part 3, transgression. The term transphobia is not sufficient if we want to talk about the societal position of trans women, as they are affected by both misogyny and transphobia, and in the case of Mexican trans women, racism. In the 2007 book Whipping Girl, author Julia Serrano discusses the direct threat that trans women pose to cis-sexist masculinity. She theorizes that there are two kinds of sexism. Traditional sexism, meaning the belief that men and masculinity are superior to women and femininity, and oppositional sexism, meaning the belief that man and woman are rigid, mutually exclusive terms that cannot be switched around willy-nilly like those darn transgenders love to tell you. A trans person violating that oppositional belief is alarming, because it proves that one can move between and beyond these supposedly fundamentally different roles, and a trans woman choosing, in the perspective of a transphobe who doesn't understand how gender works, to take on the traditionally inferior role is even more disturbing in that under the patriarchy, to be a woman is to be emasculated, humiliated, and shamed. Just think of the age-old man in a dress trope, and how often it's played for both comedy and for horror. The existence of trans women in media has often been full of stereotypes and caricatures. Representation has been jokes at best and monsters at worst. As an extension of this stereotyping, trans women are often seen as something inherently sexual, seen as like a porn category rather than as, autonomous human beings with layers. Serrano points out the predator-prey dynamic between men and women, where men are seen as the natural predator and women as the natural prey. When a trans woman transitions, it's seen as an act of temptation towards cis men, because in cis-normative society's perspective, trans women have made themselves, as Serrano says, into sexual objects that no red-blooded man can resist. Serrano writes on pages 14 and 15 of Whipping Girl, "When the majority of jokes made at the expense of trans people center on men wearing dresses or men who want to cut their penises off, that is not transphobia, it is transmisogyny. When the majority of violence and sexual assaults committed against trans people is directed at trans women, that is not transphobia, it is transmisogyny." So fundamentally, transphobia then is just a general term, a more broad term for hatred or prejudice against trans people, but transmisogyny is much more specific and targeted when we're talking about the differences between how trans women are treated versus other trans people. With this intersectionality in mind, let's get into the relationship between transmisogyny and femicide. As we discussed in the previous section, femicide is about maintaining patriarchal control over women. The murder of public women is seen as a cleansing act because their existence in the public sphere is seen as a threat to masculine spaces. Transmisogyny, too, is about maintaining control over women. Patriarchy relies on the belief that men and women are fundamentally opposed categories under oppositional sexism, and this opposition allows men to feel superior under traditional sexism. As gender theorist Judith Butler said when asked why men kill trans women in a 2015 interview for Vice, "Killing is an act of power, a way of reasserting domination, even a way of saying, I am the one who decides who lives and dies. So killing establishes the killer as sovereign in the moment that he kills, and that is the most toxic form that masculinity can take. Trans women have relinquished masculinity, showing that it can be, and that is very threatening to a man who wants to see his power as an intrinsic feature of who he is. Just as men kill cis women for their presence in the masculine public sphere, men kill trans women for the publicness of their relinquished masculinity. A violent response to feeling the gendered predator-prey dynamics shift. They perceive these dynamics shifting and they react with violence. Often, in the eyes of patriarchal and transphobic society, the murderers are simply the victims of an ill-fated flirtation or joke who reacted in a justified manner. Just as when the Mexican government blamed the victims of femicide for their own deaths, Butler states that a lack of police response to the murder of trans women sends the same message as the murderer, that the murder is justified because the trans woman dared to violate societal understandings of gender. The murders of public women are deemed acceptable, as are the murders of trans women. Both are disposable under the gendered necropolitics of a transphobic and patriarchal society. Jesus Ociel Baena was the first non-binary person to become a magistrate in Mexico. They were known for pairing pristine blazers, shirts, and ties with vibrant skirts, and for accessorizing with iconic high heels and red lipstick. Baena, along with their partner, were found dead in their home on November 13th of this year. In thinking about transmisogyny in a specifically Mexican context, their death is a prime example not only of the ways that trans people are targeted and victimized, but also how the Mexican government dismisses the deaths that they deem to be acceptable. After the government claimed that Baena's death was caused by a, quote, personal matter, despite the magistrate having faced multiple death threats over social media very publicly, protesters took to the streets. An article by animalpolitico.com discusses the trends of murdered trans Mexican women. Full disclosure, this article is in Spanish. I do not speak Spanish. So I put it through Google Translate. Because of this, I'm going to stick mostly to the numbers provided in this article, as that should give us an idea of the violence that trans Mexican women face. The article states that from the years 2007 to 2022, there were an average of 53 trans people murdered each year. In 2022, at least 87 queer and trans people faced violence on the basis of their gender or sexuality, 48 of which were trans women. This means that in that year, trans women were the victims of 55.2 of anti-LGBTQ+ hate crimes in Mexico. Some of the most common areas where the victims worked were as hairdressers, sex workers, and in commerce. According to a report by the organization Letra S, after the homicide, the bodies of the 48 trans women were found on public roads, at their home, in a canal or river, at their workplace, and in the countryside, in a hotel, and in other spaces. Clearly, there are some parallels to the murder of the witch. She was a sex worker. Her body was found in a canal. You see the connections. Part 4. Brando. Similarly to how the victims of femicide are silenced, Melchor purposely does not give the witch a voice of her own. There's no chapter dedicated to the witch's perspective like there is for Yesenia, Norma, Brando, and Moonra. Instead, everything we learn about her is from other characters' perspectives, namely those 4. Through these perspectives, we are given a clear view of how trans people are viewed in La Matosa. As mentioned earlier, Moonra was alarmed to discover that the witch was transgender, and, he says on page 82, the very thought of that homo's hands on him creeped him out. So we see the disgust and fear of trans women already in this novel. The disgust and fear at the very possibility of being implicated in anything other than good old-fashioned cisgender heterosexual masculinity is echoed later in the book in Brando's chapter. Brando is a queer but deeply closeted and homophobic young man who routinely refers to the witch as both the F slur and the T slur, and sees her as vapid, pathetic, and prone to having, quote, bitchy meltdowns. In other words, he paints her as the sexist stereotype of a shallow, hysterical woman, and that's only made worse by the fact that she's trans. He's shown to be genuinely terrified by the thought of the witch, as he views her as something predatory and grotesque. Melchor says on page 166, his mother would go on and on at him to get indoors, but he never would. So then his mother would tell him that if he didn't go inside that minute, the witch would come and take him away. And one day, by pure chance, Christ, what a fucking coincidence, who should be walking down the street but the queer who'd show up in Via every now and then, dressed all in black and with her face covered by a veil, the freak they called the witch. And that day his mother pointed at her and said to Brando, see, here comes the witch to get you. And Brando looked up and found himself standing right before that grotesque specter, and quick as a flash he darted into the house and under his bed, and it was a long time before he dared play on the street again. So all-consuming was his fear of the witch. As Judith Butler told us already, killing is an act of domination. And in killing the witch, Brando aims to kill the queerness inside of himself. The witch has relinquished masculinity, and Brando, a rapist and murderer with violent, pedophilic, bestialic fantasies, the very picture of toxic masculinity, is deeply disturbed by the idea of Louise-Me's lack of shame in being sexually involved with her. The witch is a threat to the social order that made Brando, and the idea of someone being able to escape it and embrace her identity is intolerable to him. Regarding Brando's discomfort watching Louise-Me and the witch, Melchor writes that he saw it as, quote, a sordid attack on his manhood. Brando has been shown repeatedly to react with violence when his sexuality is in any way called into question. After he sexually assaults Louise-Me while he sleeps, Brando regrets not having killed him, and he plans to kill both his mother and Louise-Me after he kills the witch. His fear of the witch is caused by transmisogyny and internalized homophobia and internalized transphobia, and as someone who has embraced the toxic masculinity of his environment, Brando's response to that fear is violence. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence of the witch's murder being an act of femicide is this. Brando says after the murder, on page 148, the witch deserved it, for being a dirty fag, for being a cunt and a bully. No one was going to miss that cock-sucking witch. Brando didn't even regret what happened. In his mind, she deserved it for being trans, for being queer, for daring to live outside of what Brando could allow for himself. Just as cis women are blamed for their own murders, so is the witch. She was too public, and therefore she deserved to die. Part 5. Humanizing the victim. When the Mexican government ignored the increasing rate of femicide in Ciudad Juarez, anti-femicide activists responded by reminding the public that these women and girls were just like women and girls that you know and love. Wright writes on page 715, the coalition fought the government's gendered necropolitics by challenging the discourse of the public woman and the violent gendering of space that justified the murders as evidence of a normal life, by personalizing the victim and introducing them to the public as daughters. The move drew on other social movements in Mexico and Latin America in which activists, many of them mothers, fought against repressive states that used violent tactics to squash social protest. By referring to the victims of violence as innocent children, the coalition used this tactic as a way to fight against the public woman discourse, not by fully dismantling it, but by rejecting the idea that good daughters did not have a legitimate place in the city's public sphere, on its streets, and in its factories. In hurricane season, Melchor does exactly this. She not only personalizes the witch by giving the reader a strong sense of who she was from the second chapter on, but she humanizes her. She makes the witch a distinct character whose struggles we clearly don't have the information to fully understand, and she leaves us just enough hints to have an idea of the witch's personal perspective and experience. Think of the witch crying during karaoke, decked out in vibrant wigs, able to be seen and wanted only when surrounded by drugged-out young men who she knows are not afraid to get violent. Think of the verbal and physical abuse she faced by her mother, and think, too, of her hiding that corpse in the locked room for years and years, constantly dealing with people trying to force their way inside in search of money that they will always see as more important than she is. Hurricane Season is a case study, a fictionalization of very real pain, a recounting of the specific atmospheric pressures that lead to catastrophe. Melchor forces the reader to experience this claustrophobic feeling of unrelenting violence through long, twisting sentences and paragraphs that span entire chapters, going as long as 60 pages without a moment to rest your eyes. Through this immersive reading experience, Melchor humanizes not only the witch, but all of the characters trapped in this hurricane of violence that seems to never end. Even Brando has moments of beauty and genuine struggle that is really touching and impactful to read, even though he's done terrible things. In the final chapter of the novel, we meet an old grandfather who is digging a mass grave. Boys from the morgue unload bodies from an ambulance. There's a girl who had been chopped to pieces, an infant, along with the faceless, sexless remnants of people. Finally, a body that's implied to be the witch's is unloaded. And finally, the heaviest and most unwieldy of all, the one the workers had to wrap up in sheets because the skin kept coming away in flaps whenever they tried to tie its hands and legs. The one that was going to be more of a headache for the grandfather than the rest of them put together, even more than the dismembered girl, because not only had the bastard been violently slashed to death, but he was still whole. Rotten, but whole. Even though the grandfather treats the dead with respect, handles them with care, and speaks to them gently, the witch is misgendered in death. All that's left of her is her body. And without her being there, alive, to assert her womanhood, she's erased. People will make assumptions on her identity based on her body because that's all that's left of her. Femicide is an act of silencing, and in killing the witch, Brando silenced her forever. While literature has the power to give those people a voice, it has its limits, and Melchor acknowledges this. Even when we try to acknowledge and honor the victims of femicide, we will never know the intricacies of who they are, who they were. Hurricane Season highlights the tragedy of that loss, and at the same time, it comforts us with a reassurance that the violence is not all that there is, and that the violence does not last forever. These are the last lines of the book, spoken by the grandfather to the bodies. Don't you worry, don't fret. You just lie there, that's it. The sky flashed with lightning, and a muffled boom shook the earth. The rain can't hurt you now, and the darkness doesn't last forever. See there? See that light shining in the distance? The little light that looks like a star? That's where you're headed, he told them. That's the way out of this hole. If you watched this, thank you. I haven't made one of these videos before. It's kind of nerve-wracking, but exciting. I made this for a class, but if for any reasons you watched this and you would like to see more of them, let me know, because I would love to make video essays. I think that they're so fun. Yeah, thank you for watching.